Just to say good evening to everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to talk. It's the first time I've ever done a talk on Zoom. I'm only just getting used to using Zoom. So when Andy said, have you got some slides to put up? I said, I don't know how to do that yet, but it is the next thing on my agenda when it comes to Zoom meetings to be able to do that. I've tried to locate my camera so that I can look vaguely at the words that I'm reading off a little script here and speaking to, but also look as I'm at least close to looking at you where you are. I'm conscious with Zoom, the temptation is to look around, and I've got a big screen to look all over the place at other people and never look as though you're actually addressing the people that you're talking to, but I'll do my best. And I'm in awe of some of the people, some of you, as you gather this evening in terms of your credentials with regard to ecology and commitment to all things ecological already. So anyway, we'll see where the conversation goes. I simply prepared the paper itself that that Andy's referred to is one that I prepared for the senior church leaders in the free churches across Yorkshire, so Methodist, United Reformed and Baptist, in the context of the Joint Public Issues team for Yorkshire, which I currently convene. Prior to picking up the appointment that I've got at the moment as a circuit superintendent, I was the church's regional officer for Yorkshire and the Humber, and working out of Leeds for some 8 years or so, preparing policy papers addressing issues of social justice and politics and all that side of things. So I found myself involved in something I never expected to be involved in. Actually, it wasn't something that I felt any sincere calling to, but I thoroughly enjoyed and found very engaging at the time. However, if my heart is anywhere, it's always been with the ecological side of things as an issue. It'll become apparent. I did a PhD before coming into circuit ministry, which was completed in 1994, so it's 26 years ago. But as I'll say a little bit later, I found myself humiliated in the last 18 months by one Greta Thunberg, that I hadn't done an awful lot more since then, or between then and now. So this is something I'm kind of picking up at this stage. So the church leaders have actually had sight of the paper that I prepared. I would say it's been received, I would say, relatively warmly. When I talked about it at the JPIT meeting back in February, Kevin Watson, the moderator of the URC, did say that if this took off, it would sound the death knell for all of the denominations. But I don't believe that that's true, and it's something that I would be very keen not to happen. Equally, there is an urgency about all of this, which I feel quite acutely, and that's why I've written what I've written. So I shall go from here. What you're effectively getting is the paper itself in kind of an abbreviated form, I guess, plus a longer preamble, which perhaps explains a little bit about where I'm coming from currently at the moment, or at least gives some sense of where this has emerged from. In terms of writing in the first place. So I'm Philip B. I'm Superintendent Minister of a circuit called Denbigh and Clayton West, which you've probably never heard of. It's a little patch in Yorkshire West, but which butts up against South Yorkshire. We found ourselves one of the circuits that was kind of didn't amalgamate with anybody else. So we're just in this kind of little corner. There's nine of us in the circuit, 9 churches in the circuit, 2 members of staff, and it's all quite small, but it's what I'd call rural industrial. These are old mining villages and railway towns and that sort of stuff, stuck in the middle of what is effectively South Pennines running up into West Yorkshire. So quite an interesting rural area, particularly given that a lot of what I've done in the past has been more focused on urban theology and urban areas. We lost both our banks in the last 5 years. We've still got local shops in Penistone, which is where my main focus is, and unusually people still doff their hat and say good morning to each other as they walk up and down the high street, which is quite nice. And I'm sure that you will find the same in some of the places that you are in York, in and around York. The bell ringing traditions are writ deep into culture in and around Penistone. There used to be what was called a Thurleston Bell Orchestra with 1,000 bells that are still stored beneath the local primary school. They were bought by public subscription, so anybody can use them if they want to. But the bells fell silent in the early noughties when nobody did any bell ringing anymore. My main church is Methodist United Reformed Church, LEP, in the High Street in Penistone, and 5 years ago we set up a small handbell ringing group for children. Since the handbells were too large for the children to manage, we bought them hand chimes, and they've gone from there. The group had no name until some smart local called them the Clangers, which was oddly a name that stuck. And they are now the St Andrews Clangers. They played at last year's Harvest Festival, a harvest festival which majored on climate change and the need to address climate change seriously if we're to enjoy the sort of harvest that we do across the world at this moment in time. One of the congregation who goes there gave a short testimony about her work as a research scientist at Sheffield University, where she's developing new types of rice that are drought resistant for use in the Philippines in future years when climate change is expected to make the annual rains less certain. And the Clangers played their usual tunes to the obvious pleasure of parents and grandparents who come to worship most usually when the Clangers are playing. They closed the worship in a different way, however. Instead of a blessing, the 12 children stood at the front of the church and each played out a single tone, allowing it to ring out and die in the air before turning around to face away from the congregation. A single note for each of the 12 years that UN IPCC 1.5 special report published in October 2018 says we have to reduce our carbon emissions by half. Can you just hold on a moment, because I've got my stepdaughter clanging around in the kitchen in her own inimitable way. Hang on a second. Grace, I'm doing a talk on Zoom. If you can just turn the volume down. My apologies. I don't know if you can hear that in the background, but I can. Anyway, there we go. So it was a moving moment for me at the end of the service, and for other people as well, when I found myself moved by what the Clangers were doing. But I'd already found myself moved earlier in the year by one Greta Thunberg. In fact, rather than moved, I would have said shamed by the arrival of a 16-year-old girl who reminds us all in no uncertain terms of our need to care for the planet because, as she says, our world is on fire. I have no excuse. I completed a PhD in ecological theology 26 years ago. The arguments are pretty well the same now as they were then. The language has changed from global warming to climate change, and climate change science, I suppose, now is agreed by overwhelming consensus in a way that it wasn't back then. It's not possible sensibly to argue about the facts of climate change. The arguments arise, therefore, around the capacity that we have to act as human beings and to respond urgently to the facts and to the issues. And in the meantime, while we work out how we do that, my Clangers will continue at each Harvest Festival between now and 2030 to ring out their chimes, this year 11 bells, assuming we can meet, next year 10, and so on until 2030-31, by which time, well, what? Sounding 12 bells is a good way of recognising the urgency of the crisis. And if you Google sounding 12 bells, you'll find that there is an organisation that's been organising this, particularly out of London, I think, but in response to climate change. So it's something they're encouraging bell ringers to do across the country if they can, to acknowledge all of these things. But the urgency of a crisis, which I would have said is exploding in slow motion all around us. This is the climate change emergency. And the question for me is not, do you believe the science? The question is, do you feel the disruption between humanity and God's world? And if you can feel it, and if we can help others to feel it, then I believe we have a chance, because whilst it's late, it's not too late yet. But as far as I'm concerned, the bells are ringing. So that's my kind of preamble. What you'll get after this is the kind of towards a green church stuff that you've come here for. But on a personal level, it's on the above basis that I come to this meeting with proposals for a green church. As I say, they've been shared with senior church leaders across Yorkshire with some support and encouragement. And regardless of whether it picks up elsewhere or whether there are others who kind of want to follow it, it's certainly something that we are going to be pursuing in our circuit ecumenically over the course of the next few years. What I want to say by way of background is that in the last 2 years, I think, the social momentum around climate change has gathered pace. Children striking from schools, on the one hand, Greta Thunberg being given a stage in the way that she has on the other side of things, but also governments and corporations appearing now to respond seriously to what's taking place. As I say, the science is pretty well unquestioned, at least as far as I'm concerned. Even the media don't give airtime to climate change deniers anymore. And as far as I'm concerned, their time wasted in a literal sense, because there is no time to waste. Churches are responding with more vigour than they were, and some of you have testified to that this evening. But primarily, and you may want to correct me on this, primarily as I see it, the response is as one issue of social justice among a whole plethora of others that concern us as church. So whether it's asylum seekers or food banks or homelessness or overseas development, there are a plethora of social justice issues that we can commit ourselves to, and probably do, well-intentioned as we are, and it's quite right that we do. But part of the argument that I'd want to make is that climate change is a qualitatively different sort of issue from the other social issues that I've been talking about. Another minister said to me recently, climate change is your passion, isn't it? Mine is ecumenism, he said. And on that basis alone, I would want to say to you that climate change is not my passion. If we are to take climate change seriously, or at least with the seriousness that it needs, it cannot just be another passion to lay equally alongside other passions. It cannot be another issue of social justice to lay alongside other issues of social justice. It's different. The urgency and scale of the problem makes it so, but it's different in other ways too. Climate change, as far as I'm concerned, throws up questions about our human identity, our relationship with the world, our theological understanding of redemption, and all of those things have implications for worship and liturgy as well. All of which creates, I think, too, a new opportunity for evangelism as we transition into whole new lifestyles and patterns of behaviour. That transition is one prong of a three-pronged need if humanity is to succeed in addressing climate change. We need international cooperation politically, for which we need to campaign. And our churches and the campaigning organisations that we associate ourselves with help us to do that, and are doing well, I think. We need creative new technologies, and we need to rely on our scientists in order to be able to address some of those. So perhaps to some extent our scientists will come to our aid in that respect too. But thirdly, and this is where it really kicks in for me, it's the changes in lifestyle and behaviour that we need socially, at a social level, that we need to engage with on a level, on a scale that we haven't witnessed, I suspect, for 250 years. And Christianity, alongside other religions, is well placed to contribute substantially to the third of these things, to changes in lifestyle and behaviour. We do personal change well, or at least we have in the past. So why a green church then? Well, to help people transition to these new lifestyles and behaviours that are in step with the patterns and rhythms of God's created order. Religion's good at this. Some of the work that I did when I first arrived in Leeds was to examine how Leeds had evolved as a city. So it was quite interesting to look at some of that. But 250 years ago, one way or another, people moved or were moved away from the land, from rural life into cities that were industrialising at the time. They were moved from the cottage to the factory. And I believe it's true to say, though with some simplicity perhaps, that Methodism contributed substantially and significantly to helping people to transition to that new way of life. The Sunday school movement, the explosion of churches in the cities, the earthed theology of the free churches gave people hope as they committed themselves to new patterns of life governed by urban time rather than by rural time. And a green church, I believe, can do the same, helping people to rediscover the same patterns and rhythms of God's created order that have never disappeared completely, but have become hidden behind ever higher city skylines and factory clocks that determined how people's days panned out. So that's why a green church, to help people transition to those new lifestyles. Secondarily, to move faster and further in responding to the climate emergency as a climate emergency. So there's a lot of campaigning happening. There's moves to become zero carbon churches, carbon zero churches and communities, and all of that is good. But a green church, I would argue, understands the climate emergency as a qualitatively different issue of social justice, which requires a holistic approach. So it's good. All my churches are all aiming for eco awards. It's good to obtain bronze, silver, gold eco awards. It's good to engage with Operation Noah. It's good to focus, as we've done recently with Christian Aid, on climate justice. But these are focal points for action that a green church would embrace. But a green church makes worship critically important as we urgently reconnect with a God who creates and redeems all that is. So thirdly, then, why a green church? To uncover a more complete theology of redemption that shapes a new and vibrant evangelism. To recognize that redemption is not about the exclusive salvation of human beings over and against anything else that God has made, but about the redemption of the whole world. And there are Bible passages, they're few and far between, but there are Bible passages that argue for this sort of cosmic Christ, which we mostly skip over and forget. But it takes us beyond simply a salvation of souls to life everlasting and reminds us of a Christ who also promises fullness of life in this world, which I would argue we discover in the blessing of a walk in step with the rhythms and patterns of God's creation. So finally, and moving towards the end, what sort of green church? Worship obviously is a significant part of all of this. It's what would root us and our actions. But worship in places where we sense a connection with God's world. Somebody was talking about, was it Ribblesdale, where it's difficult not to feel that sense of connection or that sense of disruption, I think, when you're seeing things on your TV screens. But in places where we sense a connection with God's world, so in certain places, at times, so I would say outdoor services. We're talking about gardens, high places. We've got Royd Moor viewing points near us in Penistone where you can see for miles around. It gets very cold up there in winter, but there must be times of year when it's possible to do a service in the little thing that they constructed for the millennium, in gardens, by reservoirs, in the outdoor places where we encounter God. At times that pattern rhythms, the rhythms of creation, as well as the redemptive story of Jesus. So Advent services of light and dark, it strikes me that Christingle services that I do, and a really phenomenal thing in our area, people don't start Christmas where we are until they've done their Christingle services, but even an outdoor Christingle services or services of light and dark, actually they lend themselves well to being outdoor and to reflecting on the world around us. Easter garden services, which focus as well as on the redemptive story, on spring and new life. Summer services in high places where we feel the wind of change, as well as Pentecost and the challenge that comes with that change too. Autumn services of harvest, Thanksgiving, which of course lend themselves quite readily to that anyway. But services of worship that give opportunities for Holy Communion, where earthly symbols of bread and wine root us. You know, there are liturgies that one can work out with that. Praise to the Creator alongside God's creation. I longed this year, the first of my ecologically outdoor services was going to be in the garden at a little church called Bull House in the middle of nowhere. It's adjacent to a farm, but the chapel actually belongs to the farmer. But it's the oldest church chapel in England, independent chapel in England with a worshipping congregation. It was built in 16 something or other. But we were going to do something out there. They've got a fantastic garden. They always have a sunrise service for Easter. And of course, COVID has put an end to that for the time being. But praise to a creator with God's creation in those sorts of environments where you can listen to the birds singing and join in, if you like, with the praise of creation that takes place. So communion, praise, repentance as we commit ourselves to new ways of living, new patterns of lifestyles. And prayer for people and places and parts of creation whose life is disrupted and ruptured by the damage that we do through global warming. Where we find friendship and fellowship with others who are similarly committed to walking in this new way of life, and where we draw new people to a Christianity which understands the significance of the changes needed. It's been an odd thing. On the odd occasions when I have raised this, I was preaching at a Bull House last year, and there were some 16-year-old girls who were singing as part of the celebration for rebuilding the chapel or renewing the chapel. And I was talking to them about the future rather than about the past and what this might mean for the chapel there now. We were talking about an ecological framework for the mission that they might sense in that place. And the girls that were there singing, I talked to them afterwards. They're all striking from the local grammar school and travelling to Leeds. But that was the part of the conversation that we had in the church. That was part of church that afternoon that resonated with them. And it struck me at that point then that this is something where I do think that we're going, potentially we have the opportunity to engage with younger people on their ground, I suspect, rather than necessarily ours, in terms of presenting the gospel message in new ways or to that particular context. And then, of course, to model this new life to one another as a kind of support to one another. In terms of organisation, it's about feel rather than denomination. I see it as being an ecumenical thing, but if there are Christians around that feel this and get it in that way, then I think there's an opportunity to work with those people in creating Green Church, which helps other people to feel that too. Evangelical in the way that I've been talking about, reigniting the gospel message with an urgency which is immediately obvious to ordinary people, or more immediately so. Light touch on property finance and admin. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, there wouldn't be that much of a need for eco awards for churches, because if you don't have one, if there is no building to keep up, no finances, no admin, actually you're talking about something that's perhaps lighter touch than we're used to. Connecting people through places, worship and social media rather than through buildings there forward, and straightforward denominational ties that usually tie us to one another. But connecting people to their local denominational churches if that works for them. In terms of developmental needs, I mean, my feeling is that we need to identify some pioneers who feel all of this for establishing a network of green churches across Yorkshire. My feeling is that we need to think big if we're really going to engage with this at the level that it needs engaging with. So I would have said there needed to be a network of green churches across Yorkshire within the next 4 years, which takes us halfway to 2030, or halfway through the 12 years. So we need to identify pioneers. There needs to be some sort of steering group to project manage the development of it. A creative worship group that develops resources to worship outside in liturgical and theological forms that resonate with the created order and the redemptive story of Christ. And also a group to focus advocacy and campaigning work. And then I would have said, given that I'm now 59 and feeling my age somewhat, and given the conversations that I've had with younger people, to identify a younger leadership for all of this as soon as possible, to give the movement the energy that it needs amongst the people that are feeling this most acutely, would be an important part of kind of moving things on. So if I could just summarize very briefly, okay, as far as I'm concerned, climate change emergency demanding a more urgent and far-reaching response from the churches than we currently have, even given the commitments that you've talked about already. Ecological theology that reshapes our understanding of being human, of creation and redemption, and which impacts on worship and evangelism. And then thirdly, a need for a rapid expansion of expressions of Green Church to help people to transition into lifestyles in concert with the rhythms and patterns of God's created order, to supplement or complement what's going on in the world of science and politics as people work together on that. That's kind of all that I've got to say, but that pretty well summarizes the paper, Andy, if that's okay. I know that you've read that, but
that's
yeah.
great. Thank you ever so much. There was an awful lot in what Philip's just shared. I'm working on the assumption, like me, a few of the things Philip shared have kind of fired little kind of sparks or want to follow-ups or questions. So I suggest we just have a time of conversation now. And maybe you want to quiz Philip. It may be you want to make a point. Maybe you want to amplify something Philip said. But should we just go into that sort of time now? I won't start. I've got a few things written down, but I'll open the floor. So if you want to unmute yourself and fire away, we'll do Q&A with each other, I think, because I don't think Philip's standing here saying I'm the expert, and as he's recognised, there are some big brains in the room and people who've got quite a lot of experience. So I think we can possibly respond to one another as we go forward as well.
Yeah. I've probably not taken in properly what was being said, but Your main suggestion to me came across as you think we should have some outdoor services, or all services outdoors, and get rid of buildings. Have I taken that wrongly?
I mean, I hope it's more than that. There's some theological development to do with that as well. I mean, it would be quite a challenge to the church, I suspect, some of this, even in terms of reshaping some of the theological focus that we've got. I mean, some of that work has already been done, I think, but it's more about creating an environment in which we can, I suspect that we can evangelize with young people that takes them outside of the denominational frameworks that we have at the moment, and actually majors on the issue that I suspect is key for all of them. Does that answer your question?
Well, I'm not really sure how that works out practically, because the practical thing you said was let's have things outside. Yeah. So that's really my.
I mean, in my own head, it's bigger than. In my own head, it's bigger than just having the odd service outside. I mean, what I've got in my head there are 4 services that seem to fit with particular patterns for the year. That's kind of how I was going to work things out here. But I think there are rhythms and patterns beyond the 4 that I mentioned that we can relate to. I'm not quite sure whether it would be possible to meet outdoors on every occasion, every time. So it may be a question of borrowing space as well, and sometimes being indoors. But I don't see the need, given all the churches that we already have, I don't see the need for new buildings. Yeah. Hi, Chris.
Hi. Yeah, so I just think it's quite interesting. I think you probably need to think about it wider than just a single issue of the environment. You've probably got access to a whole group of people who don't go to church, who have got common interests which include the environment. And it might be a way that you could use to reshape the offering of the church in general. So if you could promote the church as a modern thinking, relevant organisation, and the environment was part of that, then that will be really good. So, for example, I run a mental health support group, as I said. I know that the people in that group are interested in church, and I don't know where to send them, because on a Sunday morning at 10 o'clock to listen to a hymn prayer sandwich for them is not going to be right. But if I could send them somewhere, like I own some woodlands, so I'll say now, if you want to start your church in my woods, you're very welcome to, and I think that will be great. But I think we need to be very careful of 2 things. First of all, if we start clinging to the idea of the climate change and the way we couch it, in those terms, we start running into identity politics, and the kind of reason why the Labour Party was completely destroyed at the polls this year, and people will start to clump the church in with that kind of political offering. And I think we need to be careful in the way we couch it, and even the way we talk about it, because I think the way we talk about climate change as if it's something happening out there is wrong. It's really about how the world is going to just be rubbish, and how the air is filthy, and we're all going to die of cancer. And I think if we think about the way we talk to the public about it, that'd be really good. And also, obviously, paganism, because that's very, Gaia, Mother Earth, all that stuff, and all the woo-woo new spirituality stuff that you hear about is very connected to the Earth Mother and stuff. And we need to be careful that if we do go down that route, we're offering something where we're not worshipping the Earth. Theologically, I know nothing about theology. I'm a nobody, but it's just something that comes to mind. And I hear it often said that you can worship creation without worshipping the Earth, which I think is a good way of putting it.
There are some folks. Is it one of the guys on the New Connectional team has done a lot of stuff with New Age spirituality and green ecology and theology, hasn't he? And I was kind of interested in. Because Nicola introduced herself as having belonged to Heworth and now doing ecology, and I was like, why can't we be both? So
no, I do belong to Heworth. I just don't get involved with any of the. I don't volunteer much for it.
Yeah,
my energies go into the Green Party now.
But that in itself is kind of. It feels like it's a.
I can't. Well, one person can't do everything.
No.
This is where I felt I was being led. So,
yeah, no, I'm entirely with you.
Yeah,
I'm just kind of, it's a sort of sadness that it feels like the overlap isn't there.
Yeah.
I think.
Isn't it just like being sent on a mission though? Because you embed yourself where you feel called to be.
Yeah.
So for Nicola, sorry.
Oh yeah. I'm not being critical of Nicola. I'm being critical of the church that in a sense they haven't followed Nicola. I think. I'm
not sure. I think it's part of this. Go out into the world and change it. Don't just sit in your churches. So I don't think it's necessarily a failing of the church. It's just where I have felt I should be.
Yeah.
But yes.
Well, I know. I mean, I've got kids who are teenagers, and they're absolutely would probably be more interested in what you have to say, Nicola, than what I have to say in the book.
Really?
Yeah. Well, it's not a surprise, is it, Chris? No, I know. But even if I was, any minister, because I don't think there's an obvious link for them between who we are as Christians, even though we talk about the environment, and the green activism, let's say, more than I think they think it's all talk and no action.
Well, I think I was expecting this to be more about what we can do in our church buildings, make them as green and energy efficient as possible and things like that. Well, if we're thinking moving out of them, fine, because yes, we do maintain a lot of buildings, but that helps us to be inclusive and let all sorts of people in with different abilities. So I thought that was what this was going to be about, rather than a theological direction, more than anything. Because if we can't say we think there's climate change if we're just giving lip service to it and not changing our churches so that they use as little energy as possible and all that sort of thing. So I was thinking it was going to be more on the practical side. Yeah.
I think for me, it's more about changing individuals. It's changing our personal behaviours and that sort of thing.
Well, the thing is, even if everybody in this country changed their personal behaviour, it's not going to change the system. It's not enough. You can't do it on your own.
No, I agree, which is why I was saying that there's the three things. There's the technology side of things, but there is also the political and the campaign.
I suppose there's the spiritual change, isn't there? Yes, you've got to commit.
I mean, that's the thing though. We can all change our churches to eco boilers and put energy efficient light bulbs in, but if one member of our church flies to Australia and back, then we've undone all of that. And so being able to change people as individuals, and being able to lobby and sort of have a critical mass of people that are engaged, that want to, lobby local government, lobby businesses, encourage that systematic change at a governmental level and at a business level. That's going to have the biggest impact.
Yeah, that's good. I think I'm coming from, well, if we haven't put our own houses in order first, we can't go out preaching to other people.
That's very good.
And I think we're not there yet. Our churches should be passive house standard. Shouldn't be using any energy at all.
I would say that that Leslie did comment when we said we were having this meeting that he's got a carbon neutral agenda that he's pushing for in the district. I don't honestly know what shape that is and what implication it is and what he's going to do to achieve that. I'd be fascinating to find out. But I think it's encouraging to hear somebody's got that on their radar. But part of me is bothered about, and this isn't just eco agenda, I don't think we can move any church fast enough that we will have that place where we can speak with authority from. Something will always get in the way, and COVID is the latest thing that's just depleted our funds. And so I feel I responded to Philip's call, I suppose, to think, well, but we could start one from fresh that sat alongside our other churches and was an exemplar and started with the right principles. And yes, it's part of a system that's broken, but actually, isn't that what we did with fair trade? We built something that stood apart and used it to kind of challenge the status quo of the system. And I don't honestly think we can do it from within. I think it would take us so long to change that it won't make an impact. That, not to say we shouldn't do it, but
I think it's more a question of knowing that you're nowhere near and that you're trying to move there. Because it's no good saying, we've got all our light bulbs are energy efficient, but we're still throwing loads of heat out the roof or whatever, or the walls. people are going to say, well, you're not eco, why should I listen to you? But if you say, well, we're working on it, we've got all these plans, this is how we're going to get there, or whatever, I think that's fine. It's just, you have to, you know, recognise you can't be hypocritical.
Yeah.
Some of it is a humility of understanding you're on a journey, because otherwise, if we wait till we're perfect, well, we'd never get there. But also, even in our environment, if we were meeting on top of a hill somewhere, we'd have used some transport to get there, and some people would have used not their legs and a bicycle to get there. So in a way, we're being authentic by saying we're making it taking steps towards, but haven't got there.
I'd want to agree with that. I mean, that's significant for me. It's about a direction of travel and turning people around. That the repentant side of things, the confession for where we've been and what we've done, and turning ourselves around. It's never going to be complete at the point at which you've turned around. You've just begun walking in a different direction and attempting to change as best you can. I mean, one of the things that I find most difficult is being part of a family where they don't necessarily feel as acutely as I do that sense of disruption. How do you live in community, even with your own family, in moving in that direction, or carrying people with you? You can't make them go with you. Equally, Nicola, when it comes to the churches and them changing, I've got another 4 years here myself in this circuit. I would be staggered if I had got any of those churches to the positions that you're talking about themselves. You know, the arguments I'm having with them are about whether climate change exists or not for some of them, and it's to step outside of that and to try and create opportunities to start to walk ourselves and to gather people who want to walk in that direction, but to create an environment in which we can then try to draw other people into that way. Now, that's for the sake of the church. I mean, it's for the sake of the redemptive gospel theology that we have and want to develop, but also for the sake of the planet and that the need that there is to move in that direction, and the capacity I think that religion does have to play within that. I do think there's a significance about that. It was kind of the conclusion of my PhD 26 years ago. The religion had a significant part to play, and actually the PhD was about Gaia. It was about the Gaia hypothesis, and it considered quite a lot of the New Age, pagan side of things as well, Chris. I don't find myself particularly anxious or frightened or worried about that side of things. We had witches turning up to conferences that I was doing at the time, announcing themselves very proudly as witches, as though that was supposed to frighten us, everybody. In fact, it was one of the books that I read was by a witch called Starhawk in America. I found it very, very helpful, really, to be honest. But, yeah.
One of the reasons we have this group, which is normally a group of pioneers, is that we have a place to talk where you don't have to spend 80% of your energy convincing people that your idea of the church needs to change.
No, what Philip said made perfect sense, but I hadn't realised that's where we were coming from.
Yeah, no, I'm talking.
You're trying to give a new example to the existing because it's hard trying to argue with them, which I can completely understand. I know they're exactly the same.
But more generally, we have this pioneer gathering for people who want the church to change, and we find there's a great freedom in being able to talk to people who kind of are at that point. And then you spend your energy generating ideas and testing and supporting one another in how to make those changes. And for me, there would be a massive value in assembling people who buy climate change, buy the need to change, buy that the church can be part of it, and start the conversation there with, and then where do we go with this, and how do we move this forward? And that was another thing Philip kind of mentioned in his paper, I think, was a social network of people who are like-minded, who can buzz, who can enthuse, who can encourage, who can I don't know, stay aflame, really, because I very much have this image that those of us who motivate and change are like burning coals into a cold pit of coal, and they go out, and you have to keep going back to the fire and replenishing your passions. And so I'm interested to whether you think that is an issue, particularly in the green ecological world, and whether you think that would have value, whether that's a church, whether that's a gathering of people, or whether that's something else.
Can I just
Philip,
add,
what was in your head?
can I just add something to what you were saying? It's also about, I think it's about buying the notion that there is a social context for evangelism when evangelism takes off. So, I mean, I would have said 250 years, there was a social context that Methodism, I mean, in Leeds, it was the Unitarian Church as well, but both those churches had a significant impact on how people transitioned into a new way of urban living. But it was the social context that gave, that allowed Methodism to give expression to the gospel in that context, which resonated with people. And I see this, the climate change thing, it's something that has got to happen. If people do not change their behaviors and lifestyles, actually we're scuppered. Regardless of what happens with regard to politics, and I suspect science as well, is those three things have to happen together. So therefore, there is a social context in which evangelism will be taking place. And that makes sense to me. I've never been an evangelical, but I find myself more evangelical, more evangelistic, thinking about that as a social context than I ever have done in the past, a social context with which to work. That actually makes sense of people buying into it.
Can I just make a couple of observations? So first of all, I think that there are two myths of climate change that are really widespread and I think have been actively promoted by those with most to lose from propagating them, from them being found out, essentially. And one of them is that the individual is the key to solving this. And so if you look around us today, we're in this absolutely unique situation where everyone's car's parked practically. The whole economy has closed, and yet the net impact on fossil fuel emissions this year is just about what we need to do to reach those the targets that we're setting ourselves for 2030. That's the only impact of completely closing down 3/4 of the world population, essentially. So it isn't about individuals. That's the first thing. And yes, and I think that is something that big business has pushed on us deliberately to try and make people think, okay, there. And the second myth is that you have to have everything right, that hypocrisy is necessary to remove in all ways. And I don't think that is the case. I think you need to show that you're going the right way, that you've got the right movement, but it's a very easy argument for people to say, well, didn't you drive to this meeting? Or something like that. And that is always going to be the case. And I think that works only as an argument against people getting involved, only if it's built up with the same myth that it's the individual that is going to make a difference here. If it's not the individual too much, and it really isn't, we know exactly what the contribution of individuals versus businesses are to this thing, then the whole hypocrisy thing is a non-argument, really. And I think that getting that messaging clear from the environmental side is really important to begin with. And the third and final observation I wanted to make is that I think that there's a real value in getting people who are committed to changing the church in this area together. And I think that there is a lot of people who are interested and isolated and want to join up. But I also think that there's a lot of the conversation is inventing stuff that has already been discussed and debated. And I've heard exactly the same set of arguments here. As I don't know if you know some of the history of what is now eco-church and how it evolved from eco-congregation, and how the sort of separate program called Wild Christian has gone alongside that. But this has been a pathway that I've seen trying to be non-denominational, but working with a whole range of churches across the country. And Scotland has gone a different way to England, but it's been an interesting thing. So my wife actually set up the Eco Congregation program in Scotland many years ago, And so we've seen a lot of these things evolving in the last 20 years now. There's a lot to be learnt from what's going on already, it's my feeling.
It would be helpful, it might be helpful to have a conversation, Colin, at some stage, because I'd welcome the benefit of your advice on that, or at least for you to actually expand on what you've said, because it doesn't surprise me that you're saying what you're saying, but I don't understand, because I've not been part of the conversations, I don't understand what the arguments are or how things have worked out in the way that they have. But I'm not aware of anybody trying formally to establish a green church as such, which is separated. It wouldn't surprise me if people are trying to do it, but I've not come across it.
There's an organisation, Forest Church, which grew out of Fresh Expressions of Church, which, as its name implies, meets in a forest. Just going back to that question about the individual being key, in many ways the individual is the key, because if individuals all get together, then you can force change, as you saw with Extinction Rebellion, managing to get the government to declare a climate emergency, which wouldn't have happened without the activities of Extinction Rebellion. So I think there's a big key there to say that an individual, one person on their own, is not going to make a big difference, but getting together with a load of other individuals is going to make an awful difference. I was out in Zambia last year with Christian Aid. I'm a volunteer speaker with Christian Aid, and I saw the effects of climate change out there, and it's horrendous. They haven't had rain in the central belt of Africa for around 2 years, and the crops are dry. The water table has dropped by about 30 meters, and if we don't all start doing something about it soon, parts of the world are going to be uninhabitable. So I think an interesting idea of Green Church, but also I think the main churches need to be far more vocal than they have been. There was an Operation Noah report which came out, it was advertised in Green Christian last week, I believe it was, which talked about divesting funds from the various fossil fuel companies. The Church of England have said, oh, we'll do it sometime, and I think they've set 2030 as their target. The Methodist Church in 2017, I believe it was, said that they would look into it. And the Operation Noah report says, isn't it about time you actually started doing something about it? And the link which I followed up, talking to the Central Finance Board at the Methodist Church, and they're sending to the 2020 conference, which meets at the end of June. I don't know too much about it, but that may have some views on how the Methodist Church are going to progress. Anything else, it should be coming out next week, I believe. What else asked?
I think I'm just, it would be interesting to hear a little bit from Colin collectively, because I think I'm a little bit cynical about the ability of Eco Church as a kind of brand, and Eco Congregation as a brand to move the existing church forward. That's my bugbear. Not that I don't want to use that tool, because it's got status, it's got recognition. But the point Philip was making about the younger generation is I just don't feel, I feel there's a lot of passion out there of people, young people of faith, who don't know where to engage to make a difference with that faith. So I'm feeling the need to give them a home, if nothing else. So it's not about converting them to Christianity. I think I think the Christianity is embedded in their passion for the environment. They may not name it as such, but they have this God-given passion for the environment. And I just want a place where they can stand with integrity with other people and think, yes, I can be part of this without undermining my values, I suppose. I don't know. Can you unpack a bit more about your comments, Colin, in a helpful way? Or are you cynical, or are you kind of saying this is a good thing, but actually it's got limits?
I think that the Eco Church program, as it's running at the moment, is very, very broad. But I think that what it has as a major strength is or potentially has as a major strength, is its ability to join and connect the interested people that are embedded within existing congregations of all types, and get them to share experiences, because it is the same thing. You know, there is there's a not insignificant proportion of the everyday churchgoers in the UK who believe that the church is about saving souls and has nothing to do with bring on the apocalypse, and that is an anathema to me. And I think that there's very good theological arguments against that, but I think that the reality of the wider church congregation at the moment is that any change that is going to be large enough on a population level needs to touch most of these churches, and so starting small is a good way on a program that is then free, and networks people, sort of highlights that there's an interest in this congregation over there. There's someone who's interested over there. It might only be one or two people that are running these things in each place, is the reality of the system. But identifying those people and helping them get together, I think, is really important. Because, and I think that actually targeting that energy is useful, because it's very easy for people to pick one or two things, let's change the boiler, whatever, and say, well, that's it, we're done. But it is it's about creating a movement that people can identify with on a broad scale, and that also allows the respected voices of the church to be heard. So I think that although I argued against the sort of hypocrisy argument, I think that if we're not doing anything, and we've got to do a little thing as much as possible, and that's what I think Eco Church is great at, saying, well, we're on the way, we recognise this issue, we're moving. But yes, let's be humble. Let's say it's not there yet, and it's a long way to go. And I'm quite frustrated with some of the Anglican way of doing things and the vested interests within the Church of England, to be honest. The church commissioners are a brake on a lot of environmental things because they have vested interests in it not going on. It's a reality that is a challenge to deal with. But something interdenominational that links people is a great thing, I think. I'm not sure I've answered any of your questions there, but
well, I found that personally helpful. The breadth and the targeting seem like the hard things to hold in tension, aren't they? And so I wonder whether you aim for multiple small target groups that are networked together. But anyway, Philip, listening to that, any thoughts from yourself?
I still want a further conversation with Colin at some stage, I think. I mean, I was certainly more encouraged by what you said that time, and to be honest, if Eco Church is already doing what it is, I don't know whether I've put over a good vision or the vision as I see it anyway, but if Eco Church is already doing it in exploring it with you, I'd be wanting to put my back into Eco Church. And I've probably not explored as far as I ought to. I'm aware of things, Operation Now. I'm aware of a lot more of what was happening in 1994 in a way, and it's only Greta Thunberg that's kind of kicked me around in the last 18 months and maybe encouraged me to do a little bit more about the whole thing. But I do think I do think there's a significance in individuals coming together. I do think it's just one part of everything. In my own churches, I mean, part of my, I can persuade all of my churches. I mean, I run the church councils. I can persuade them all to go for eco awards. I've done it virtually recently anyway. So it's not stretching them so far that they're not prepared to go for eco awards. And if they get a bronze or a silver, then they've done okay. And some of them can't even get gold anyway, simply because how the church is designed or something, so they say. So that's kind of good, but that's about the building. It's about the people who are there at the moment. Yeah, you might want to come back on that, but I'll just finish what I'm saying, because it's about having something that I can attract younger people into. That the people who burn with this, who do have a passion for this, who do get it and do feel it, I would love to be able to draw them together into an environment where actually we are all trying to move together in the same direction. We may all be in different places, but at least we're trying to move and model together. I couldn't possibly get them into any of my 9 churches. There's not a cat in hell's chance I'm going to get them in. That's probably what I want to say on that. Colin, do you want to come back on what I was saying? You were going to say something more about Eco Church, I think.
So I would say that there's 2 things there as well. So I think Eco Church, in its initial, the Bronze Award it's essentially a menu of things. What most churches tend to pick on are the physical, let's do this to our building, because it's easy. But there is a whole theological module within there that allows you to explore theology. And there's so they're sort of divided into different modules, and most people go for the plain boring ones, but there's absolutely potential to explore different types of worship, different ways of being church within that program, particularly. So that essentially the way the eco-congregation process was really broad. That award, which still runs in Scotland, has 10 modules, and you have to pick as a church for your Bronze Award. You have to do something, I think it's sort of 6 areas, 6 of the 10 modules. You've got to do at least 3 activities in them. There's each one of them has a menu of these things. For a silver, you go on, and it is really broad, and it's very hard work for churches. It actually really means something for them to progress through this. The Eco Church program has rolled back on that for the entry level, for the bronze thing. So let's go for something really light touch that in fact doesn't have any management, that is a mass participation thing because of the personnel involved in it. You know, there's 18,000 churches that want to sign up for Eco Congregation. And if that involves sending someone out to inspect and to read paperwork about what's happened, that's an enormous task. Yeah. That then comes on later, and that's where this networking is that the sort of, once you start applying for a silver award, then we're moving people around between these congregations. So, well, this person, they've already got a silver, let's get them into your congregation talking about how you're doing these and that sort of thing. And that's the way we're moving that forwards for the next little way, to try and move people around and get them to look at what's going on. In terms of young people's engagement in the whole process, so sort of slightly differently, this is not something that we have found easy. And we did have some marketing research through Yorkshire UK this year, actually, back in January, looking at the concerns of young people in church. And the young people in church are definitely not interested in eco-congregation or in environmental issues. Not there. And in fact, the way it pans across the UK, more generally outside of church, is that there is a rather small but very vocal group of young people. It's not as large in general as people might envisage. When you give them the choice, you say, well, reality, you know, you've got exams coming up. Do you want to revise for your exams, or do you want to plant another tree? Or what are you actually asking them to do? they're not as engaged as you might expect. And as a way of doing evangelism, I think that the best way to target those people, is because they're also dispersed, is to go to places like Greenbelt and festivals that are full of young people with a similar interest already, and be present there, meet them there, and then run virtual things for the rest of the year. I think that there's quite a good presence at those types of festivals, and there's a lot of people who are engaged there. I think there's very little follow-up through the rest of the year, and I think that would be worthwhile, and resourcing those people, those young people, would be great. But I don't think you're going to find within any one local area a core of young people who will come around the environmental issues. I think they're dispersed, and their energies are dispersed.
Wondering whether Amy or Fran have experience of this. I'm sorry, I don't know everybody else. Because Amy specifically works with youth.
Yeah, well, I think I kind of agree. I think a lot of the time it is hard to get a group of young people big enough to make a change, or to feel like they've got a community around them where they can make a change. It is something that we've talked a lot with our young people in the York circuit about over the last couple of years, I guess. And I think it's such a big thing. It encompasses a lot of things. So, you know, it seems a bit daunting for them as well. And that whole individual thing where one person can make a difference, but how much of a difference does it make if it's just that one person? I think, yeah, I'd agree that finding a group big enough for them to feel like they're actually making a difference is difficult in single areas. But yeah, I think
sorry, I dropped you in it, but I know you didn't you organise the litter pick at Scarborough?
Yeah, Lorraine did that. Yeah, we've done quite a few kind of. Well, yeah, we did the litter pick at Scarborough at Flourish. It's not exactly environmentalism stuff, but we did sleep out for the homeless in December last year. We've organised a few things for them, and we get a few people in and out. But they have other commitments, and you know, they want to do well at school. They want to have a social life, and they're only young, so of course they don't want those things. You know, it's difficult for them to make those kind of decisions, I guess. So, but yeah,
I think to some extent, like, youth want to rebel. There's like an inbuilt want to rebel, and if we can rebel against our parents who, you know, keep leaving light switches on or buying water bottles, like, let's rebel against them. So there's always that. I think the danger is sometimes with the whole let's use this to target youth and to evangelize youth or evangelize people, is it then just becomes like board game church or bread church. It becomes something you do that people who are interested in that become part of. And I think there is a real scope to educate and to change people's ways of life, and, you know, and I think in some ways this pandemic is going to cause everybody to amend their life. You know, they've changed their lives. Everybody said 4 months ago, oh, we can't possibly change the way we live. We couldn't possibly stop flying and, you know, stop burning coal and all this sort of stuff. And look, we've just completely changed the way we live. So I think from an education point of view, for young people, it's really good. And then it stops it becoming an extra thing. Oh, yes, I'm green, I'm eco-friendly. It's just like not being racist. It's just part of what everybody is. Yeah. It's not something to say you're proud of, because it's just, yeah, part of who you are.
And I think I sort of resonate with that. I think the point I was making was if it's part of your core values, and part of a value structure, which obviously at the heart of it we're Christians, so it's Christ, isn't it? But if it was, I mean, Colin, listening to what you're saying, it seems to be that, again, the lost generation of churchgoers might be the key to this. the dads, the 25 to 55-year-old people who stay away from church in their droves. Are they the demographic you would see as more important, the ones who are most polluting? The Mondeo drivers and the, in my case, Volvo drivers, diesel. Sorry, everyone, 2 litres, very fast car, love it. Can't afford electric.
I was responding really to what I thought might have been picked up from a few other people saying that this is a good way to get youth in church.
Yeah. It's not. Probably not.
I think that it would be a really good way. I think that there are a lot of young people who are engaged in this, but they're very disparate, and they could be brought together just as everyone at different generations who are engaged, and it's still a disparate population. Virtual connections are a great way to go, I think.
I'll just make a point, an observation, Philip, about some of the things and the words, the phraseology you use, which really kind of, I kind of come back on a bit. You say engage younger people on their ground, and we've talked about eco-church and bringing them to church. And I'm wondering whether we actually need to be more of a kingdom of God and be with them and integrate where they are, because as Andy, you've mentioned, there is the passion possibly, and they've got it. I've worked with some people, XR, down the Hebden Valley. They've got such passion and they've got such an understanding of what I would call faith, maybe not what we would recognise as faith, but actually could actually be described as God, but in different words. And it's whether we want to engage with them on their ground and stay there and be part with that group, and they can see Jesus in the way that we are, or we then say, you must come back to the sanctuary of our chapel because that's where you'll find God. I don't believe that's true, and I don't believe any of us here believe that. I think we need to be more integrated with people. So when we say to gather and to walk, we need to gather with them and walk with them where they are rather than anything else.
I certainly wouldn't want to be bringing them back to our churches. No, it's not that sort of evangelism, I don't think. It's evangelism that's rooted in social context and the need for social change, the need for personal change. I mean, actually, I'd love to see my congregations or the churches that I've got engage with this in the way that the young people already are. So there is something about meeting people where they are, but there is also something in terms of evangelism about meeting people where they are with a gospel message which actually should itself be transformative. So it's not simply allowing them to be where they are, but saying, actually, we've got a good story here. We've got a good, we've got a good gospel story with a good, some good theology there, which actually religion. And I'd want to make it broader than that. Really, it's to say the religion is good. At this, it's a good vehicle for helping people and sustaining people through change. I mean, coming back to Colin on the, the idea that it's Greenbelt. And I mean, ever since I've been in ministry, people have come back from Easter People or Spring Harvest or Greenbelt and said, but church isn't like this, so therefore there's nowhere for me to go. Even I was chaplain at Warwick at one stage, Warwick University, and you got people who would say that their church was the Christian Union, but then at the end of university, where there was no more Christian Union, they dropped out of church because there was nowhere to go. And I suspect that in the back of my mind it's about creating something that is not church as we know it, and allowing it to be shaped around the people that we find who do get it, who do feel this and feel the need for change, and seeing if there are ways that we can sustain them in and through that change, through a gospel initiative or through a church which allows them to meet and express the identity that I suspect that they have. I'm not getting this right, but it's certainly not about bringing people into the churches that we've got. It's the last place I want to take anybody, really.
Why?
And there's something that, Chris, there's something important for me about not treating it as being the same, another justice issue. I mean, I've spent the last 8 years through to 2014 dealing with health reforms, social care reforms, with big society with universal credit and welfare reforms and all the different justices. I mean, the Christian Aid one that cropped up recently, the climate justice that they bring up is really, really important. But it's not encouraging people to change their lives by way of climate change. They have a separate program for that. But as you read your way through the climate justice thing, it's about the inequality that is created by climate change for people in certain parts of the world. Yeah. So give us your money for Christian Aid so that we can continue to do the work that we've always done with those people in that place because they're being negatively impacted by climate change. But it's still part of a different sort of social justice. And I feel that there is something qualitatively different about what we're engaging with climate change in terms of the social context that we're meeting, the need for personal inner change, and not simply treating it as being a social justice that meets our need as Christians to be compassionate, that fits within that kind of compassion that we generate through Christian engagement with people in the world.
I have this part of me feels the answer probably isn't a green church, but it possibly is, and this is where Colin's link with Greenbelt comes up. It possibly is a tertiary belonging to a stream of church that meets periodically through the year, but regular enough that it feels like it keeps you going. So as I said, this pioneer group we have meets monthly to keep us going, to enthuse, to share ideas, to move. And I know people who are part of the Franciscan movement as well as being Methodists, or part of the Holy Paraclete at Whitby and part of the Methodist Church, or part of the Northumbrian community and part of the Methodist Church. And I kind of feel this might be that kind of para community where we commit to meet, we commit to action, we commit to relationship, and there is an identity to it, and there is perhaps like Greenbelt, perhaps Greenbelt is the annual gathering, but there are opportunities to gather, opportunities to physically meet and or do some significant action or significant lobbying, but that's the shape, as I would see it, would be a para community, a tertiary community that sits alongside multiple denominations and multiple belongings. I don't know if that's enough though, but that to me gives opportunity, I think, for sort of dipping your toe into something that excites you, enthuses you, and coming back to normal church and trying to change a normal church. It's the Greenbelt hit, but not once a year, kind of multiple times a year. What do you think?
I suspect that that's close to where I would want to be at the moment. If we were meeting 4 times a year to celebrate the things that I've talked about in that kind of rotation, that cycle, that rhythm, that would probably be enough for the time being. I think that's how I've conceived of things in my local circuit. And it's not for me about jettisoning local church and all that I do within that. I don't want not to be part of that, but I do want a new environment in which to be able to try to draw other people. So it would be something I would be committing to from the denomination that I'm a part of, in order to create space, and hopefully evangelical space, to draw other people in without necessarily ever wanting them to come back to the church that I'm a part of. And if that then evolves from there and becomes more than something 3 monthly and picks up other rhythms and cycles that, actually the 7-day cycle makes some sense to me. I think it was Moltmann that said that the high point of creation wasn't day 6 when human beings were created, it was day 7 when we learned to worship, and there is something significant about that for me. If we got to that stage, that would be great. But actually for the time being, I could live with trying to gather people together and draw people into that gathering who are not part of normal church.
There's some interesting pioneer group. The Beachcomber FX in the northeast is quite an interesting church community, because they have multiple entry points and they have different expressions of being. And I'm fascinated. I'm going to get David Wynne to come and talk to us at some point. But so one of their Sundays or one of their weekdays, I don't know what day of the week it is is walking in nature, litter picking, chatting, being together. Another day is using art, doing art. Another day is Sunday at the pub. But you are able to be a member of the activist part of the church, or the gathering part, or the worshipping part, or all four parts. And when I think Green Church and things we talked about, I think there's multiple strands. There's lobbying, there's personal activism, there's worship, there's, you know, we could imagine 4 different strands where people only want to engage with one. Like, we could find a lot of support for an activist strand that was non-religious. And, you know, I noticed Hillary's gone, but maybe Hillary would be part of a lobbying strand and only want to be part of that. Another part would be all about worship. And so I wonder if it needs to be more frequent than once a quarter, but have different strands of being.
I think network is just so fundamental, because if you're a little bit inspired to do a bit of lobbying, you need to meet other people who have got a spark to do some lobbying too, because everything's, you know, harder when you're on your own. And if you're the only person in your church with that spark, then, you know, and you're in your abnormal physical church, whatever, on a Sunday, you know, that makes it harder. And I mean, I feel really blessed because I think our congregation is really open to all this. And when we have done services with a more eco-friendly theme or whatever, or the kids have pushed it and other people have pushed it, it's been really well received. But it's moving people on from that, rather than just saying, buy yourself a reusable water bottle, and actually trying to encourage people. But when other things are flying at you, you know, it's good to meet and to have the spark and have the network, I think.
But do you think maybe, I mean, it might just be me being very tired, but I feel like there's enough things going on and there are enough people doing this, and I think we've probably got forming through the pioneer stuff, the potting shed stuff that we're doing, just ways of keeping in touch, so that we are networking and supporting and encouraging each other, rather than trying to set up something else. You know, there are things we can dip into and use. And you know, I was listening to something earlier that was saying, why don't we just say, oh, let's all listen to this, and then just randomly meet and discuss it, rather than say, let's put this date in the diary every 3 weeks or whatever. And each of us have got different networks, and, you know, if we share what we're doing, we can encourage. And I don't know, I'm worried about making another structure.
Another a third Tuesday of the month we meet and talk about eco-church.
And I think let's just get on and do it. And you know, some of us want to campaign against the HS2 thing. Let's just let each other know what we're doing. And I don't know, maybe I'm too wishy-washy and vague, but I just think I don't want another thing to subscribe to.
I suppose it depends on the shape of the things that emerge from that more organic, doesn't it, as to whether they meet needs or not. But you're right, in theory it should. If it's coming from the Holy Spirit, then we should get different flavours of fresh things emerge that are resonating with what people are called to.
And sharing good practice and having peer-to-peer support. I mean, one thing we've learned the last 2 months is this sort of environment can be quite quickly set up and accessed, and somebody can dip in and find, oh, this wasn't exactly what I wanted to join in with this evening, and dip out again, or
go and sort the kids out when they come.
Yeah, you can still bath the children. I mean, how wonderful is that? And so it's time light and resource light, so that as well it feels authentic. We're not traveling anywhere to get to this, and so it's sort of it's a mix of encouragement and accountability to each other, because you share stories of what's working well, what isn't working well, And I don't know. I had a different thought. I don't know what time-wise. Are we running near the end, Andy?
Well, it depends. I mean, Zoom is more tiring than normal meetings, isn't it? That's a reality. I mean, in theory, we allow ourselves till past, but maybe we should think about drawing to a conclusion. I'd like to give Philip a chance to come back, see, and to have some thoughts about how we move forward, if at all. But share your idea, Angie. Are people flagging? Would you like to wrap it up in the next 10 minutes? Chris is. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll try and bring to a conclusion. But share your thing, Angie, and then we'll let Philip come back.
Just really quick. You'd expect me to advocate for bricks and mortar because that's my thing as well. But in fact, it's not the bricks and mortar. It is all about the people. But one of the things I'm learning with talking to churches about their hunger, about being back in place, i.e. its location, not the buildings that are important, is that there are really, I'm sorry that Nicola's gone, because there are real practical things. We've got situations now where we're probably going to be able to meet in open air situations more easily, and lack of toilets immediately is the issue. And I'm sorry, I always bring toilets into the conversation, but you've got to accept there are some practicalities of offering hospitality, of caring for each other. And buildings, lovely, wonderful, environmentally friendly buildings would be great. So I'd always advocate for fewer buildings, but have them to be passive house and, you know, all really wonderful buildings for the environment. But we shouldn't just reject buildings. And then just quickly picking up on what Andy's saying about being involved with this church that's being sold, we're in discussions with a church that hasn't had a building before, and they bring to us all these blessings that having place offers. So you have to be careful about being, if you're sort of aspiring to this very nomadic vision, what you might be letting go of through that.
Does anybody else want to share two thoughts? Philip, do you want to respond to anything before we wrap up? Are you encouraged, discouraged?
Do you know, I don't really know, to be honest. It would have been lovely if there'd been 16 people here, all of whom had said, we'd like to be pioneer ministers for a green church and we'll join you on Sunday or whatever it happens to be. But I found it interesting, and it's really helpful to hear some of the things. I mean, what Colin's talking about with Eco Church, actually, I need to become more aware of what's going on there and how those sorts of things work. Anyway, I found it very helpful hearing, you know, the notions of para community and tertiary belonging, the beachcomber thing that you were talking about as well. All of these things resonate with me in the way that I'm perhaps thinking about things. I've never been particularly evangelical. It's not kind of where I've come from. I've always approached Christianity and church from social justice point of view. You know, not those two things are in, you know, contrary to one another, but it's kind of where I've come from. I've never been bothered about getting people back into church, and it's become a focal point for the churches in which the circuit in which I exist, because the churches are going to close, and that's as straightforward as that if they don't somehow or other regenerate. And it's become apparent in the last 5 or 6 years that that people are not engaged with what we are doing in that environment. So for me, it's about taking it outside of that. It's about marrying that up with, what I feel. I think what I've always felt on the social justice side of things is a step beyond what we normally do by way of our compassions. It's something that has always resonated with me more acutely than anything else. And it just strikes me as being a social context, which particularly with the impetus that Greta Thunberg's given to things, that there is a context there with which we are able to work that perhaps allows us to do things differently. I mean, it's still something it's something I'm going to do in our circuit, whatever, anyway, or at least in our circuit, in or around our circuit. There'll be things going on along the lines that I've been talking about. But I mean, what I'd want to say is if there are other people who feel it the same way, or for whom something this evening has resonated in the same way, I'd be very interested to keep in touch. And I certainly think I might want further conversation with you, Andy, about some of the things you've been talking about, and probably with Colin to kind of to try and skill myself up a little bit better on where eco church and eco congregations have been, and all that sort of stuff too. So I'm grateful for the conversation and the discussion this evening anyway. Thank you.